For more than 4 decades, a strange buzz has been coming from a single shortwave frequency. It can continue for hours, days, and even years. Then, sometimes, the buzzing stops. A voice appears. It reads out a call sign, a series of numbers, and words that seem to make no sense. Then the voice disappears, and the buzzing returns. Over the years, listeners around the world have given the signal a name: the buzzer. But no one outside the network behind the transmission knows exactly what those broadcasts are for. The earliest confirmed recordings of the station date back to 1982, although reports from shortwave listeners suggest that it may have been heard as far back as the late 1970s. In those early recordings, the transmission sounded different from the one heard today. Instead of the familiar buzz, listeners heard a repeating 2-second, 2-tone signal that continued for long periods without interruption. Around 1992, that pattern changed. The 2-tone signal disappeared, replaced by the distinctive buzzing sound that would eventually give the station its most recognizable name. For years, that buzz remained almost all anyone could hear from the frequency, repeating again and again with no explanation of who was behind it. Then, on December 24, 1997, something happened that changed the mystery completely. The buzzing stopped. A human voice came through. It was the first known recorded voice transmission from the station. The speaker gave a call sign followed by numbers and a code word. The call sign was pronounced UZB76, although Western listeners initially heard it as UVB76. That mistranscription would eventually become the name by which the station became famous around the world. For years, the frequency had revealed almost nothing about what was happening behind the transmission. Now, there was finally a human voice attached to it. And 4 years later, the frequency would carry something no listener had expected to hear. On November 3, 2001, listeners monitoring the frequency heard an open microphone carrying fragments of a conversation from somewhere inside the transmitting facility. Then a male voice came through clearly. "I am 143, not receiving the generator." Another voice responded, apparently discussing the equipment. The brief recording offered something the earlier broadcasts never had: a glimpse inside the facility behind the transmission. The incident lasted only a short time, but it showed that the frequency could carry more than its familiar repeating sound. In the years that followed, deliberate voice broadcasts appeared at irregular intervals. On September 12, 2002, one transmission included the station's call sign followed by 62691, Isafet, 369-38270. Later broadcasts contained other combinations of numbers and words, including Konstantin and Tatiana. To anyone listening, the words offered no obvious explanation. They could have identified a recipient, authenticated a transmission, or referred to instructions whose meaning was known only to the people using the network. Then the frequency returns to its familiar pattern, with long periods of buzzing separating the occasional voice broadcasts. For years, there was little else to reveal. Then, in 2010, the silence lasted longer than usual, and when the buzzer returned, it was no longer quite the same.
If you enjoy mysteries like this, consider subscribing.
By 2010, the buzzer had been transmitting from the Povarovo area near Moscow for years. Then, in June, the signal went silent for roughly a day. When it returned, listeners began hearing music and other noises alongside the broadcast. In August, parts of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake were heard on the frequency, followed by footsteps, movement, and other disturbances. For Russian listeners, the music carried an unsettling historical association. Swan Lake had appeared on Soviet television during moments of political crisis, including the 1991 coup attempt, when regular programming was replaced by repeated broadcasts of the ballet. Now, years later, the same music was suddenly coming through a mysterious military radio frequency. There was no public explanation for why it had appeared. Then, on September 7th, the station began transmitting under a new call sign, MDZHB. Around the same period, specialist monitoring records placed the former transmitter at the 143rd Communication Hub in Povarovo and associated the post-2010 operation with the newly formed Western Military District following Russia's military restructuring that year. The exact reason for the relocation and its connection to that restructuring remains unclear. The former facility was eventually abandoned. In 2011, urban explorers entered the site and discovered equipment and log books connecting it to transmissions on 4,625 kilohertz. For years, listeners had known the buzzer only through its broadcasts. Now, they could finally see the physical installation behind the signal. But the transmitter was gone, and the broadcast continued. The buzzer had survived the loss of its own facility. So if the building was not the thing that mattered, what was the buzzer actually designed to do? The answer begins with the way the frequency was used. The buzzer was not a conventional radio station broadcasting music, news, or a scheduled program. Its continuous signal appears to have served a practical purpose, keeping 4,625 kilohertz occupied and identifiable while allowing voice traffic to pass through when necessary. That pattern is one reason the buzzer is generally described as a military communications station rather than a conventional numbers station. Numbers stations are usually associated with one-way coded broadcasts intended for specific recipients. The buzzer appears to have served a broader operational role, with the frequency maintained as part of a communications network rather than used only when a message needed to be sent. The meaning of those transmissions may have depended on procedures known only to the people within the command chain. A sequence that sounds meaningless to an outside listener could have a precise function within that operation. But we only ever hear one side of the communication. Whatever happens after the transmission reaches its intended recipient remains hidden. And that missing half gave rise to a far darker possibility. What if the buzzer was connected to something far more dangerous? One of the darkest explanations connected the buzzer to a Soviet-era nuclear command system known as perimeter, often called the dead hand in the West. The popular version of the story was simple. The buzzer was supposedly part of a system that monitored whether Russia's leadership and military command structure were still functioning. If the signal disappeared, the theory claimed, an automated process could interpret that silence as evidence of a catastrophic attack and begin a nuclear retaliation sequence. It was an unsettling image, a radio transmission continuing day after day, while somewhere beneath the surface, a nuclear command system was supposedly waiting for the signal to disappear. But there is a fundamental problem with that explanation. No credible public evidence connects the buzzer itself to perimeter or identifies 4,625 kilohertz as a trigger for the nuclear system. The connection comes from speculation surrounding the station rather than documented evidence showing that the two belong to the same operation. Perimeter itself was also more complicated than the popular story suggests. It was designed as a backup mechanism for maintaining a retaliatory capability if Soviet command structures were destroyed. Public information about its exact architecture remains limited, but available accounts describe multiple conditions and safeguards rather than a single shortwave signal controlling a nuclear launch. The buzzer's apparent role as a military communications channel is much better supported, but exactly what information travels through it and who ultimately receives that information remains unknown. If the buzzer was not waiting for the world to end, why was so much effort spent keeping the frequency alive? Then, in the early 2020s, outsiders found a way to challenge it. They could put their own signals directly on the buzzer's frequency. By the early 2020s, the buzzer was no longer something that only a small group of shortwave listeners could monitor. Internet-connected, software-defined radios allowed people around the world to tune directly to 4,625 kilohertz and watched the signal appear as a moving pattern across a live frequency display. Then, in January 2022, something else began appearing alongside it. Other transmissions started breaking through the buzzer. Music replaced the familiar sound, while strange patterns and short messages appeared across the spectrum. Some were deliberately shaped to produce recognizable images and text on an SDR waterfall. The frequency that had once been almost impossible for outsiders to reach had become an open target. The interruptions continued into February and March. On February 26, 2022, the Ukrainian national anthem was transmitted over the frequency. The following day, another transmission carried a message directed at Russian troops, telling them to stop fighting and walk away. A stronger signal could spread across the display and cover the buzzer's familiar pattern. Depending on the listener's location and receiver, the original transmission could sometimes still be heard underneath the competing signal. But the buzzer did not simply disappear. According to monitoring reports from the SDR community, one incident showed what appeared to be a response from the station itself. 3 transmitters were reportedly combined around 4,625 kHz, producing a much denser signal across the spectrum and drowning out the competing transmission. After roughly half an hour, the pirate broadcast stopped, and the familiar buzzer returned. And the buzzer had survived another attempt to push it aside. The question was no longer whether outsiders could interfere with the signal. It was whether the operation behind it could be stopped at all. The operation continued, even as the call signs used in its voice transmissions changed. On December 28, 2015, MDZHB was replaced by ZHUOZ. On March 1, 2019, the station adopted ANVF. Then, on December 30, 2020, another change brought the call sign NZHTI, which remains associated with the station today. But the changing call signs were only part of the story. What became more noticeable was the amount of voice traffic. For years, broadcasts could be separated by long periods of silence. Then, occasionally, the frequency would suddenly become busy. According to listener monitoring logs, on November 11, 2025, the station transmitted 24 voice messages containing 30 different words in a single day. That same month, the infrastructure itself was reportedly affected. Russian state media reported that a power outage caused by a drone strike on an electrical facility temporarily interrupted the transmission. The signal eventually returned. Then the pattern appeared again in 2026. According to online monitoring records, 20 separate voice messages were logged on June 24, 2026, containing a total of 29 code words. Among them were Vesna, Podershka, and Verdalak. 7 of those transmissions occurred within just 26 minutes. To someone listening, the words sounded almost ordinary. Vesna means spring. Podershka means support. Verdalak refers to a vampire-like creature from Slavic folklore. But their literal meanings tell us very little. Without knowing the procedures behind the broadcasts, there is no reliable way to determine what those words meant to the people receiving them. The buzzer has spent decades surviving changes that should have made an operation like this easier to lose. New call signs, new locations, technological disruption, and attempts to overwhelm the frequency. Yet the most important part of the broadcast has remained inaccessible. What remains hidden is the meaning behind the words. And somewhere behind that constant buzz, someone still knows what it is saying. What do you think the buzzer was?